Sounds familiar.
Rambo 3 was hyped as a surefire blockbuster, but it fizzled out sooner than expected and left behind no reason to be remembered. Despite its enormous budget, the movie tanked, and in this video, we're going to explore exactly that. In other words, we're going to find out WTF happened to Rambo 3, apart from the fact that it cheered for and celebrated the Afghan Mujahideen fighters. Oh yeah, that definitely happened. We're going to keep this intro short for you, but if you like this video, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. So now, let's cut to the chase. The stage for disaster had been set early on. By the late 1980s, the Rambo franchise was riding high. The first Rambo movie, First Blood, in 1982, introduced audiences to the troubled Vietnam vet named John Rambo, and then came its sequel 3 years later in 1985, titled Rambo First Blood Part 2, became a global sensation, and it's said that the movie grossed a whopping $300 million worldwide. The interesting thing about First Blood Part 2 was that the Italian stallion insisted his character's name be a part of the title, and that's precisely why the word Rambo made its way into the title, else the movie was simply going to be called First Blood Part 2. Sylvester Stallone had already become an icon of sorts because of his Rocky movies, and the character of this no-nonsense man called John Rambo became another larger-than-life persona for him. So not only was Mr. Stallone a great boxer, he was also someone who could use all kinds of guns, fly aircrafts, and set booby traps for his enemies. In essence, he was what most men wanted to become, and with such success, third Rambo film was inevitable. Rambo 3 was primed to be bigger in every way. We're talking more action, a more exotic setting, and a larger budget, like a much larger budget. The film's plot took Rambo out of his Southeast Asian haunts and dropped him into the middle of the Soviet-Afghan War. In this installment, Rambo has renounced violence to live peacefully in a Thai monastery, until his mentor, Colonel Sam Troutman, is captured by Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Rambo then launches a one-man mission to rescue his friend from a brutal Soviet colonel, fighting alongside Afghan Mujahideen freedom fighters against the occupying Red Army. On paper, it was a topical Cold War adventure with guaranteed crowd appeal. However, as the cameras began to roll, the signs of trouble loomed large like dark clouds before a torrential storm, and a string of creative and financial thunderstorms were accompanying this mega cyclone. Stallone's star power was at its peak, but the production days of Rambo 3 were when he was coming off a couple of lukewarm projects like Over the Top and Cobra. These movies had severely underperformed, and that wasn't a good omen to begin with. That added pressure to Rambo 3. For Stallone, this film needed to deliver. It simply had, or else Sylvester was looking at a much darker career path ahead. With Hollywood's biggest action hero front and center and a storyline borrowed from the Soviet-Afghan conflict, which was a current event back then, expectations were sky high. Fortunately, so were the risks, and probably the greatest bane to this movie was its supposed boon, Stallone's star power and his influence over the creative process. Little did anyone know the stage was being set for a Hollywood disaster behind the scenes and a film that would soon feel eerily out of date.
This is almost Rambo of Arabia, it's a very...
The record numbers! From the very beginning, Rambo 3 was making headlines for its unprecedented budget. Carolco Pictures, the studio behind the film, practically offered a big blank check because they were confident of this movie's success, keeping in mind the success of its predecessors. Soon, the production's cost ballooned to an estimated $58 to $63 million, which made Rambo 3 the most expensive movie ever made up until 1988. For comparison, other big 80s action hits like Return of the Jedi and Top Gun had budgets half that size. The investment in Rambo 3 was so massive that even industry insiders were amazed. Time magazine noted with bemusement that some sources pegged the budget at $63 million, with about a quarter of that going to Sylvester Stallone. Yup, Sylvester Stallone is said to have taken around $16 million for the project, which in other words means that he was probably the highest paid actor at that time, and getting Mr. John Rambo on the screen was hugely expensive in and of itself. Now, big budgets are as much a boon as they are a bane. Having a record-breaking budget created immense pressure on everyone involved. With so much money on the line, everyone expected an epic on the screen, but if that didn't happen, people were going to be disappointed. So you needed complex stunts, huge explosions, and basically a spectacle to justify that cost. Stallone himself insisted on grander, stuff like bigger action sequences, authentic locations, and high-end production values. The canvas of the movie was enormous, as Stallone described it, kinda like cinematic warfare, which required careful strategy. But pouring money into a film is no guarantee of success, and in this case, the extravagant spending foreshadowed some of the mess that was to follow. Stallone's payday. Of course, a hefty chunk of that budget went straight into its star's bank account, or rather his muscles. As we mentioned, Stallone was the highest paid actor of the 1980s, and Rambo 3 saw him reach new salary heights. He negotiated an upfront fee of $16 million for the film, which was at the time the largest initial payment ever made to an actor. To give you a comparison, this eclipsed even the $12 million he had earned for his arm wrestling flop Over the Top a year prior. So you can see that despite the flop, he was being paid big bucks, and Stallone's Rambo was big business, and he knew his worth. Stallone didn't stop at a record salary though. In true Hollywood superstar fashion, he also demanded a very special perk in form of a Gulfstream private jet. In what sounds like an outrageous rumor but is very much true, Stallone asked the studio to buy him a Gulfstream as part of his compensation, a $12 million luxury aircraft to call his own. The craziest part was that the studio actually agreed. Stallone got his jet, so on top of a paycheck that could fund a whole other action movie, the star literally flew away with a private plane for his efforts. By the time the deals were signed, Stallone's personal take from Rambo 3 was astronomical. It's no wonder people still joke that he earned about $500,000 for each line of dialogue in the film. And indeed, Rambo isn't much of a talker in this one, and truth be told, Stallone himself isn't much of a talker, is he? All of this was a huge bet on Stallone's drawing power, and in hindsight, that bet didn't quite pay off as expected. Box office reality. When Rambo 3 hit theaters in May 1988, it was subjected to a harsh reality check. Despite the hype, the US box office numbers came in far below expectations. Domestically, the movie grossed only $53.7 million and barely covered its production cost at home. This was a steep drop from Rambo 2, which had made over $150 million in North America alone. For a film touted as the most expensive ever, a $53 million domestic take was shockingly low. It opened strong and debuted at number 2 over Memorial Day weekend behind Crocodile Dundee 2. Now, the first Crocodile Dundee had made around $320 million back then, and even the second film did great monetarily, so standing right behind it was good enough. Rambo 3 quickly lost steam. The novelty that had driven Rambo's previous outings just wasn't there this time, and even the reviews were weak. There was a number of factors ranging from several behind-the-scenes problems to bad timing, which translated into underwhelming ticket sales. What saved Rambo 3 from outright financial disaster was the international box office. Overseas audiences still turned out for Rambo's brand of explosive action. The film earned about $135 million abroad, bringing the worldwide gross to roughly $189 million. If we're talking pure money, that's a decent haul and technically a profit against the production budget, but context is everything. You see, this global total was nearly half of what Rambo First Blood Part 2 had raked in just a few years prior. Given the enormous investment, Rambo 3 was a disappointment. Production itself was any director's nightmare. The troubled fate of Rambo 3 can be traced directly to its messy and uber-chaotic production. What went on behind the camera was nothing short of a war zone. In fact, Stallone later described the production as a runaway train that nobody could quite control. The issues began early. Just 2 weeks into filming, Stallone abruptly fired the original director, Russell Mulcahy, or he at least pulled enough strings to have the director fired. Mulcahy, who was fresh off cult favorite Highlander, had been Stallone's pick to helm the movie, but creative clashes exploded almost immediately. The primary issue was the casting of the Russian villains. Stallone had tasked Mulcahy with hiring a couple dozen intimidating men to serve as Soviet troops, men who were supposed to look like fierce, weathered brutes who'd look believable when they went against Rambo, the kind of dudes that would make Rambo a hero just for beating them up. Instead, when Stallone arrived on set in Israel, he was stunned to find what he described as 24 blonde, blue-eyed pretty boys that resembled rejects from a surfing contest. The extras looked more like a Chippendales troupe than a grim Soviet Spetsnaz. Stallone quipped that while Rambo isn't afraid of competition, being attacked by third-rate male models was not exactly the tone he envisioned. He confronted Mulcahy, who refused to recast the roles, so Stallone did what he could to quickly send the director and his chiffon army away. Mulcahy was out and the project was suddenly directorless. With the star calling the shots, the studio scrambled to keep the film on track. This is shockingly similar to what happened with the recent Tom Cruise Mummy movie. Instead of banking on what made the first Mummy movies work, Mr. Cruise took full creative control and turned it into one of his action films. The amount of changes he brought into the movie, simply because he was a star, is mostly why his Mummy died a quick death. Anyways, Stallone promoted Peter MacDonald, the second unit director, to become director. The minor hiccup was that MacDonald had never directed a full feature before. He was an experienced camera operator that had shot action scenes in Rambo 2, but taking over this mega-budget production was baptism by fire. MacDonald literally had 1 day to prepare for his directorial debut before inheriting one of the most expensive films ever made. To his credit, MacDonald was initially reluctant as he wasn't sure anyone could steer this careening train, but Stallone persuaded him to step up. With MacDonald in, Stallone also took the opportunity to rewrite chunks of the script, beefing up the Soviet villains and adding more of what he wanted to see. This power shuffle didn't end with the director's chair. According to on-set reports, nearly the entire production crew was overhauled around the same time. The director of photography was replaced first, followed by the assistant director and the entire camera crew. Yep, all gone after the first 2 weeks. As if that wasn't enough, the editing room also became a hot seat. 3 different editors worked simultaneously on Rambo 3 in post-production in a rush to meet deadlines. This kind of tag-team editing suggests the filmmakers were essentially patching the movie together on the fly, likely trying to make sense of the ton of footage from multiple units and changes in story direction. It's the hallmark of a troubled production. Crew members have described the whole production like a battlefield with constant conflicts, firings, and a sense that no one had a cohesive vision for the film. Stallone reflected that he felt there was a lack of preparation and clear strategy early on. The result of all of this was a film that, by the time it was completed, was something of a Frankenstein's monster, and a very expensive one at that. The timing catastrophe, when reality killed fiction. Even if Rambo 3 had been a smoother shoot, it faced a huge problem that no one could control because real-world geopolitics made the movie instantly outdated. So what happened there? Well, the film's whole premise was about Rambo joining hands with the Afghan Mujahideen to battle evil Soviet forces. Needless to say, this was conceived at the height of Cold War tensions, but by spring 1988, the Cold War was rapidly thawing. In a twist of fate, on May 15, 1988, the Soviet Union officially began withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan, and this was just 10 days before Rambo 3 opened on May 25th. In other words, as American audiences were seeing Rambo blow up fictional Soviet bad guys on screen, the actual Soviets were packing up and leaving Afghanistan in real life. And for the 10 days between the Soviets starting to leave and Rambo 3's release, US media had spoken a lot about the Soviet-Afghan situation, which meant that there was a lot of fatigue already. So yeah, this timing catastrophe robbed Rambo 3 of its relevance. What had been intended as a ripped-from-the-headlines action fantasy suddenly felt very, very obsolete. In other words, while the film was projecting a ludicrous Cold War stereotype by projecting the Soviets as gibbering sadists, the USSR was softening its own image by using this diametric policy shift called glasnost. The then Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of openness and reform were changing global perception of the Soviet Union. Peace talks were in the air, so American audiences in 1988 were far less interested in jingoistic East versus West scuffles than they might have been a few years earlier. Real-world events made Rambo 3 feel instantly dated, and as we mentioned earlier, the news was full of the Soviets retreating and the Cold War rivals making nice. So watching Rambo blast Russians to bits felt wrong and almost awkward. Back then, the Washington Post noted, "The spirit of glasnost was no match for Stallone's desire to deliver one more over-the-top war movie." But the audience's appetite had moved on. We can only speculate, but had the film come out even a year or 6 months earlier, its reception might have been very different. Heroes become villains. One of the strangest legacy issues of Rambo 3 is how its heroes and enemies inverted with time. In the movie, the Afghan Mujahideen fighters are portrayed as valiant freedom fighters. The gallant people of Afghanistan, as the end dedication calls them. Indeed, the film closes with a title card explicitly dedicated to the brave Afghan people, acknowledging their struggles against the Soviets. Back in 1988, that seemed fitting, and the US was supporting the Mujahideen in real life. Rambo's alliance with them made him a contemporary hero, standing up to America's adversary. Now, a few years later, and much before the release of the fourth Rambo movie in 2008, that same feel-good alliance aged in the worst way. Many of the factions of the Afghan rebels and foreign fighters who battled the Soviets later morphed into groups hostile to American interests. After the Soviet-Afghan War ended, Afghanistan spiraled through civil war and eventually saw the rise of the Taliban regime and the harboring of al-Qaeda terrorists. By the 2000s, Americans were fighting some of the very forces that Rambo 3 once lionized. This turned the film's upbeat ending into an awkward historical footnote. Funnily enough, there was even a famous urban legend that came up in the wake of this shift in nature of US allies. Some claimed that the original dedication in Rambo 3 thanked the brave Mujahideen fighters and was changed years later to the more generic gallant people of Afghanistan after those Mujahideen became the bad guys in the US's eyes. In truth, however, that dedication was always worded to the gallant people of Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen reference was never explicitly on screen. It was merely a sentiment. Honestly, watching Rambo 3 post 9/11 is a bizarre experience because the film asks the audience to cheer for Afghan guerrillas planting bombs on Russian helicopters without any clue of the complex and tragic chapters to follow. Behind-the-scenes war zone. Now, apart from the personnel and timing issues, the actual filming conditions for Rambo 3 were an adventure in their own right. The production was essentially a globe-trotting operation that kept running into obstacles. Initially, producers planned to shoot in Mexico and even constructed elaborate sets there, only to scrap that plan and abandon roughly $5 million worth of sets that had been built. Stallone felt that the American Southwest didn't have the right atmosphere. We're not sure if he was joking or not, but he did believe that shooting in Arizona or Nevada would have the crew hitting Vegas casinos at night, not feeling the grit of war. So the team scouted overseas. They tried Morocco, Italy, Australia, and finally, Stallone found his ideal location in the form of Israel. Stepping off the plane in Israel, Stallone said, "Yeah, this is it. It feels like the kind of place where you should make Rambo." Israel's desert landscapes could pass for Afghanistan's rugged terrain. The country's ever-present military atmosphere lent a sense of authenticity and tension. Co-star Richard Crenna noted that every day they would drive through a military checkpoint to get to the set, put on soldier costumes, and go to war for the cameras. Israeli fighter jets even occasionally roared overhead during filming, making the actors wonder where the real combat was happening. In short, filming in Israel gave cast and crew a taste of an active war zone, complete with armed soldiers nearby, palpable sense of danger in the air. And speaking of air, authenticity came with a price. The desert conditions were harsh. Shooting near the Dead Sea in the summer, the production endured temperatures around 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius under a relentless sun. The crew guzzled an estimated 400 gallons of water a day to just stay hydrated. Makeup and costumes melted in the heat, and sunburn and heat stroke became real concerns. At one point, Stallone's hair even accidentally caught on fire from a special effects explosion when a spark from a stunt went wrong in the desert heat. Logistics were another headache. The remote locations meant trucking in heavy military props and equipment over long distances. The cast and crew were lodged nearly an hour's drive from the sets, which themselves were far from any infrastructure. Everything about the shoot was an uphill battle against the elements and the clock. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, political violence intruded. Partway through the schedule, rising security threats in Israel forced the production to make a drastic change. Late 1987 would see the beginning of the Palestinian Intifada and regional instability. The Israeli government imposed restrictions on where the crew could film and what pyrotechnics they could use. Eventually, it became untenable to stage the huge final battle on Israeli soil. For safety and practical reasons, Stallone and company abruptly pulled out of Israel and relocated to Yuma, Arizona to film the climax. This decision came very late in production, almost when the movie was near completion. Imagine the consequences of having to leave Israel and improvise a new plan in the US. The sudden change caused all kinds of continuity challenges. The team lost access to authentic Soviet helicopters and tanks they had in Israel, and had to rely on mock-ups and reenactor extras in Arizona to shoot the big battle. And yet, somehow they managed to film a decent facsimile of an Afghan battlefield on a reservation in Arizona to wrap the movie. Still, if you look closely, The finale of Rambo 3 has a slightly different feel, and that's the Arizona footage filling in for what was supposed to be Israel as Afghanistan. By the end of the production, everyone was exhausted. Stallone later likened the experience to fighting a war on two fronts, one against external challenges like weather and security, and another against internal clashes of ego and vision. Director Peter McDonald did the best he could steering this runaway train, but he admitted he failed totally to humanize Rambo or change the character in any meaningful way. The film ultimately defaulted to Stallone's original larger-than-life take. In the chaos of shooting, any higher aspirations were steamrolled by the need to simply get the movie finished. In McDonald's words, "I wasn't shooting Shakespeare. At times, it was hard to take it seriously." We think that pretty much sums up the behind-the-scenes vibe. Critical and commercial failure. When Rambo 3 finally opened, the reception was cold, and especially ice-cold were the critics, who pretty much pounced on the film's thin plot and excesses. Many saw it as a caricature of the action genre, all explosions, no depth, and painfully out of step with the times. The Golden Raspberry Awards, or the Razzies, handed Rambo 3 what they called the honor roll, something that was given to a film that received at least 5 Razzie nominations at the Razzies, including Worst Picture, and Sylvester Stallone won Worst Actor for his performance. Stallone's co-star, Richard Crenna, and director Peter McDonald earned Razzie nominations as well, just to spread the blame around. It was a far cry from the praise First Blood had received for its gritty portrayal of a vet with PTSD. By the third installment, the consensus was that this series had lost any semblance of nuance or credibility. Rambo 3 felt like Stallone's $63 million vanity project, a film that was overly impressed with its stars' muscles and explosions, so much so that all concept and notion of storytelling was shot down with anti-aircraft guns. Even audience enthusiasm was mixed. The film wasn't outright rejected, but fans generally rank it as the weakest of the series. It simply didn't have the suspense or emotional hook of its predecessors. The commercial disappointment of Rambo 3 effectively killed the franchise for 2 decades. After seeing the box office drop by nearly half compared to Rambo 2 and weathering the public drubbing, the studio shelved any plans for Rambo 4. In fact, Carolco Pictures dangled a Rambo 4 project a few years later and reportedly offered Stallone an astonishing $34 million to reprise the role, but Sly turned it down, perhaps sensing that the moment wasn't right. And so, John Rambo went on the shelf. It wasn't until 2008, a full 20 years later, that Stallone resurrected the character in the film Rambo 4, bringing the aging warrior back for a new era. By then, the geopolitical landscape and action genre had changed entirely. Marvelous verdict! In hindsight, Rambo 3 is a fascinating case of a movie suffering a perfect storm of issues. A bloated budget and behind-the-scenes turmoil gave it a wobbly foundation. World events undercut its premise at the worst possible time. If the film had arrived a few years earlier, during a more heated phase of the Cold War, it might have been received as another gung-ho guilty pleasure like Rambo 2. Had it been made a few years later with a different political context or more self-awareness, it might have retooled its story. But in May 1988, history caught up with Rambo in a way even he couldn't fight. The result was an action movie that stands as a time capsule of 1980s excess and miscalculation. In the end, Rambo 3 did deliver on its own tagline: "The first was for himself, the second for his country. This time, it's for his friend." Unfortunately for Stallone and company, this time it was also for the film historians, as a lesson in how even an unstoppable action hero crash into the wall of reality. That's all we got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.